The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William L. Shirer. History of Nazi Germany. Foreword. Though I lived and worked in the Third Reich during the first half of its brief life, watching at first hand Adolf Hitler consolidate his power as dictator of this great but baffling nation, and then lead it off to war and conquest, this personal experience would not have led me to attempt to write this book, had there not occurred at the end of the World War II an event unique in history. This was the capture of most of the confidential archives of the German government and all its branches, including those of the Foreign Office, the Army and Navy, the National Socialist Party, and Heinrich Himmler's secret police. Never before, I believe, has such a vast treasure fallen into the hands of contemporary historians. Hitherto the archives of a great state, even when it was defeated in war, and its government overthrown by revolution, as happened to Germany and Russia in 1918, were preserved by it, and only those documents which served the interest of the subsequent ruling regime were ultimately published. The swift collapse of the Third Reich in the spring of 1945 resulted in the surrender not only of the vast bulk of its secret papers, but of other priceless material, such as private diaries, highly secret speeches, conference reports and correspondence, and even transcripts of telephone conversations of the Nazi leaders tapped by a special office set up by Hermann Göring in the Air Ministry. General Franz Halder, for instance, kept a voluminous diary jotted down in Gabelsberger shorthand, not only from day to day, but from hour to hour during the day. It is a unique source of concise information for the period between August 4th, 1939 and September 24th, 1942, when he was Chief of the Army General Staff and in daily contact with Hitler and the other leaders of Nazi Germany. It is the most revealing of the German diaries, but there are others of great value, including those of Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, and close party associate of Hitler, and the General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations of the High Command of the Armed Forces, OKW. There are diaries of the OKW itself and of the Naval High Command. Indeed, the 60,000 files of the German Naval Archives, which were captured at Schloss Tambach near Coburg, contain practically all the signals, ships, logs, diaries, memoranda, etc. of the German Navy from April 1945, when they were found, back to 1868, when the modern German Navy was founded. The 485 tons of records of the German Foreign Office captured by the U.S. First Army in various castles and mines in the Harz Mountains, just as they were about to be burned on orders from Berlin, cover not only the period of the Third Reich, but go back through the Weimar Republic to the beginning of the Second Reich of Bismarck. For many years after the war, tons of Nazi documents lay sealed in a large U.S. Army warehouse in Alexandria, Virginia, our government showing no interest in even opening the packing cases to see what of historical interest might lie within them, Finally, in 1955, 10 years after their capture, thanks to the initiative of the American Historical Association and the generosity of a couple of private foundations, the Alexandria papers were opened, and a pitiful small group of scholars, with an inadequate staff and equipment, went to work to sift through them and photograph them before the government, which was in a great hurry in the matter, returned them to Germany. They proved a rich find. So did such documents as the partial stenographic record of 51 Führer conferences on the daily military situation as seen and discussed at Hitler's headquarters, and the fuller text of the Nazi warlord table talk with his old party cronies and secretaries during the war. The first of these was rescued from the charred remains of some of Hitler's papers at Berchtesgaden by an intelligence officer of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division, and the second was among Martin Bormann's papers. Hundreds of thousands of captured Nazi documents were hurriedly assembled at Nuremberg as evidence in the trial of the major Nazi war criminals. While covering the first part of the trial, I collected stacks of mimeographed copies, and later the 42 published volumes of testimony and documents, supplemented by 10 volumes of English translations of many important papers. The text of other documents published in a 15-volume series on the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials was also of value, though many papers and much testimony were omitted. Finally, in addition to this unprecedented store of documents, there are the records of the exhaustive interrogation of German military officers and party and government officials, and their subsequent testimony under oath at the various post-war trials, which provide material the like of which has never been available, I believe, from such sources after previous wars. I have not read, of course, all of this staggering amount of documentation. It would be far beyond the power of a single individual, but I have worked my way through a considerable part of it, slowed down, as all toilers in this rich vineyard must be, by the lack of any suitable indexes. It is quite remarkable how little those of us who were stationed in Germany during the Nazi time, journalists and diplomats, really knew of what was going on behind the facade of the Third Reich. A totalitarian dictatorship, by its very nature, works in great secrecy, and knows how to preserve that secrecy from the prying eyes of outsiders. It was easy enough to record and describe the bare, exciting, and often revolting events in the Third Reich. Hitler's ascension to power, the Reichstag fire, the Rome blood purge, the Anschluss with Austria, the surrender of Chamberlain at Munich, the occupation of Czechoslovakia, the attacks on Poland, Scandinavia, the West, the Balkans, and Russia, the horrors of the Nazi occupation and of the concentration camps, and the liquidation of the Jews. But the fateful decisions secretly made, the intrigues, the treachery, the motives, and the aberrations which led up to them, the parts played by the principal actors behind the scenes, the extent of the terror they exercised, and their technique of organizing it. All this, and much more, remained largely hidden from us until the secret German papers turned up. Some may think that it is much too early to try to write a history of the Third Reich. that such a task should be left to a later generation of writers to whom time has given perspective. I found this view especially prevalent in France when I went to do some research there. Nothing more recent than the Napoleonic era, I was told, should be tackled by writers of history. There is much merit in this view. Most historians have waited 50 years or 100 or more before attempting to write an account of a country, an empire, an era. But was this not principally because it took that long for the pertinent documents to come to light and furnish them with the authentic material they needed? And though perspective was gained, was not something lost because the authors necessarily lacked a personal acquaintance with the life and the atmosphere of the times and with the historical figures about which they wrote? In the case of the Third Reich, and it is a unique case, almost all of the documentary material became available at its fall, and it has been enriched by the testimony of all the surviving leaders, military and civilian, in some instances before their death by execution, with such incomparable sources so soon available, and with the memory of life in Nazi Germany, and of the appearance and behavior and nature of the men who ruled it, Adolf Hitler, above all, still fresh in my mind and bones, I decided at any rate to make an attempt to set down the history of the rise and fall of the Third Reich. I lived through the whole war. Thucydides remarked in his history of the Peloponnesian War, one of the greatest works of history ever written, being of an age to comprehend events and given my attention to them in order to know the exact truth about them. I found it extremely difficult and not always possible to learn the exact truth about Hitler's Germany. The avalanche of documentary material helped one further along the road to truth than would have seemed possible 20 years ago. But its very vastness could often be confusing, and in all human records and testimony there are bound to be baffling contradictions. No doubt my own prejudices, which inevitably spring from my experience and make-up, creep through the pages of this book from time to time. I detest totalitarian dictatorships in principle, and came to loathe this one the more I lived through it, and watched its ugly assault upon the human spirit. Nevertheless, in this book I have tried to be severely objective, letting the facts speak for themselves and noting the source for each. No incidents, scenes, or quotations stem from the imagination. All are based on documents, the testimony of eyewitnesses, or my own personal observation. In the half-dozen or so occasions in which there is some speculation, where the facts are missing, this is plainly labeled as such. My interpretations, I have no doubt, will be disputed by many. That is inevitable, since no man's opinions are infallible. Those that I have ventured here in order to add clarity and depth to this narrative are merely the best I could come by from the evidence and from what knowledge and experience I have had. Adolf Hitler is probably the last of the great adventurer-conquerors in the tradition of Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon, and the Third Reich the last of the empires which set out on the path taken earlier by France, Rome, and Macedonia. The curtain was rung down on that phase of history, at least, by the sudden invention of the hydrogen bomb, of the ballistic missile, and of rockets that can be aimed to hit the moon. In our new age of terrifying lethal gadgets, which supplanted so swiftly the old one, The first great aggressive war, if it should come, will be launched by suicidal little madmen pressing an electronic button. Such a war will not last long, and none will ever follow it. There will be no conquerors and no conquest, but only the charred bones of the dead on an uninhabited planet. Book 1. The Rise of Adolf Hitler. 1. Birth of the Third Reich. On the very eve of the birth of the Third Reich, a feverish tension gripped Berlin. The Weimar Republic, it seemed obvious to almost everyone, was about to expire. For more than a year, it had been fast crumbling. General Kurt von Schleicher, who, like his immediate predecessor, Franz von Papen, cared little for the Republic and less for its democracy, and who, also like him, had ruled as Chancellor by presidential decree, without recourse to Parliament, had come to the end of his rope after 57 days in office. On Saturday, January 28, 1933, he had been abruptly dismissed by the aging President of the Republic, Field Marshal von Hindenburg. Adolf Hitler, leader of the National Socialists, the largest political party in Germany, was demanding for himself the chancellorship of the democratic republic he had sworn to destroy. The wildest rumors of what might happen were rife in the capital that fateful winter weekend, and the most alarming of them, as it happened, were not without some foundation. There were reports that Schleicher, in collusion with General Kurt von Hammerstein, the commander-in-chief of the army, was preparing a push which, with the support of the Potsdam garrison, for the purpose of arresting the president and establishing a military dictatorship. There was talk of a Nazi push. The Berlin stormtroopers, aided by Nazi sympathizers in the police, were to seize the Wilhelmstrasse, where the president's palace and most of the government ministries were located. There was talk also of a general strike. On Sunday, January 29, 100,000 workers crowded into the Lustgarten in the center of Berlin to demonstrate their opposition to making Hitler chancellor. One of their leaders attempted to get in touch with General von Hammerstein to propose joint action by the army and organized labor should Hitler be named to head a new government. Once before, at the time of the Kapp Push in 1920, a general strike had saved the Republic after the government had fled the capital. Throughout most of the night, from Sunday to Monday, Hitler paced up and down his room in the Kaiserhof Hotel of the Reichskanzlerplatz, just down the street from the Chancellery. Despite his nervousness, he was supremely confident that his hour had struck. For nearly a month, he had been secretly negotiating with Papen and the other leaders of the conservative right. He had had to compromise. He could not have a purely Nazi government, but he could be chancellor of a coalition government whose members, 8 out of 11 of whom were not Nazis, agreed with him on the abolition of the democratic Weimar regime. Only the aged dour president had seemed to stand in his way. As recently as January 26, 2 days before the advent of the crucial weekend, The grisly old field marshal had told General von Hammerstein that he had no intention whatsoever of making that Austrian corporal either Minister of Defense or Chancellor of the Reich. Yet under the influence of his son, Major Oskar von Hindenburg of Otto von Meissner, the State Secretary to the President of Papen and other members of the Palace Camarilla, the President was finally weakening. He was 86 and fading into senility. On the afternoon of Sunday, January 29th, while Hitler was having coffee and cakes with Goebbels and other aides, Hermann Göring, President of the Reichstag and second to Hitler in the Nazi Party, burst in and informed them categorically that on the morrow Hitler would be named Chancellor. Shortly before noon on Monday, January 30th, 1933, Hitler drove over to the Chancellery for an interview with Hindenburg that was to prove fateful for himself, for Germany, and for the rest of the world. From a window in the Kaiserhof, Goebbels, Röhm, and other Nazi chiefs kept an anxious watch on the door of the Chancellery, where the Führer would shortly be coming out. We would see from his face whether he had succeeded or not, Goebbels noted. For even then, they were not quite sure. Our hearts are torn back and forth between doubt, hope, joy, and discouragement, Goebbels jotted down in his diary. We have been disappointed too often for us to believe wholeheartedly in the great miracle. A few moments later, they witnessed the miracle. The man with the Charlie Chaplin mustache, who had been a down-and-out tramp in Vienna in his youth, an unknown soldier of World War I, a derelict in Munich in the first grim post-war days, the somewhat comical leader of the beer hall putsch, this spellbinder, who was not even German but Austrian, and who was only 43 years old, had just been administered the oath as Chancellor of the German Reich. He drove the 100 yards to the Kaiserhof, and was soon with his old cronies, Goebbels, Göring, Röhm, and other brownshirts who had helped him along the rocky, brawling path to power. He says nothing, and all of us say nothing, Goebbels recorded, but his eyes are full of tears. That evening, from dusk until far past midnight, the delirious Nazi stormtroopers marched in a massive torchlight parade to celebrate the victory. By the tens of thousands, they emerged in disciplined columns from the depths of the Tiergarten, passed under the triumphal arch of the Brandenburg Gate, and down the Wilhelmstrasse, their bands blaring, the old martial airs, to the thunderous beating of the drums, their voices bawling the new Horst Wessel song, and other tunes that were as old as Germany, their jackboots beating a mighty rhythm on the pavement, their torches held high and forming a ribbon of flame that illuminated the night and kindled the hundreds of onlookers massed on the sidewalk. From a window in the palace, Hindenburg looked down upon the marching throng, beating time to the military marches with his cane, apparently pleased that at last he had picked a chancellor who could rouse the people in a traditional German way. Whether the old man, in his dotage, had any inkling of what he had unleashed that day is doubtful. A story, probably apocryphal, soon spread over Berlin that in the midst of the parade he had turned to an old general and said, I didn't know we had taken so many Russian prisoners. A stone's throw down the Wilhelmstrasse, a stone's throw down the Wilhelmstrasse, this is pronounced Wilhelmstrasse. A stone's throw down the Wilhelmstrasse, Adolf Hitler stood at an open window of the Chancellery, beside himself with excitement and joy, dancing up and down, jerking his arm up continually in the Nazi salute, smiling and laughing until his eyes were again full of tears. One foreign observer watched the proceedings that evening with different feelings. The river of the fire flowed past the French embassy. André Francois Poncet, the ambassador, wrote, whence with heavy heart and filled with foreboding, I watched its luminous wake. Tired but happy, Goebbels arrived home that night at 3 a.m., scribbling in his diary before retiring. He wrote, "It is almost like a dream, a fairy tale. The new Reich has been born. 14 years of work have been crowned with victory. The German Revolution has begun." The Third Reich, which was born on January 30, 1933, Hitler boasted would endure for 1,000 years, and in Nazi parlance, it was often referred to as the 1,000-year Reich. It lasted 12 years and 4 months. But in that flicker of time, as history goes, it caused an eruption on this earth more violent and shattering than any previously experienced, raising the German people to heights of power they had not known in more than a millennium, making them at one time the masters of Europe, from the Atlantic to the Volga, from the North Cape to the Mediterranean, and then plunging them to the depths of destruction and desolation at the end of the World War, which their nation had cold-bloodedly provoked, and during which it instituted a reign of terror over the conquered peoples, which, in its calculated butchery of human life and the human spirit, outdid all the savage oppressions of the previous ages. The man who founded the Third Reich, who ruled it ruthlessly and often with uncommon shrewdness, who led it to such dizzy heights and to such a sorry end, was a person of undoubted, if evil, genius. It is true that he found in the German people, as a mysterious providence, the centuries of experience had molded them up to that time, a natural instrument which he was able to shape to his own sinister ends. But without Adolf Hitler, who was possessed of a demonic personality, a granite will, uncanny instincts, a cold ruthlessness, a remarkable intellect, a soaring imagination, and until, toward the end, when drunk with power and success, he overreached himself, an amazing capacity to size up people and situations, there almost certainly would never have been a Third Reich. It is one of the great examples, as Friedrich Meinecke, the eminent German historian, said, of the singular and incalculable power of personality in historical life. To some Germans, and no doubt to most foreigners, it appeared that a charlatan had come to power in Berlin. To the majority of Germans, Hitler had, or would shortly assume, the aura of a truly charismatic leader. They were to follow him blindly, as if he possessed a divine judgment for the next 12 tempestuous years. The advent of Adolf Hitler. Considering his origins and his early life, it would be difficult to imagine a more unlikely figure to succeed to the mantle of Bismarck, the Hohenzollern emperors, and President Hindenburg than this singular Austrian of peasant stock, who was born at 6:30 on the evening of April 20th, 1889, in the Gasthof zum Pommer, a modest inn in the town of Brunau am Inn, across the border from Bavaria. The place of birth on the Austro-German frontier was to prove sufficient, for early in his life, as a mere youth, Hitler became obsessed with the idea that there should be no border between these two German-speaking peoples, and that they both belonged in the same Reich. So strong and enduring were his feelings that at 35, when he sat in a German prison dictating the book that would become the blueprint for the Third Reich, his very first lines were concerned with the symbolic significance of his birthplace. Mein Kampf begins with these words: "Today it seems to me providential that fate should have chosen Brunau am Inn as my birthplace, for this little town lies on the boundary between two German states, which we, of the younger generation at least, have made it our life work to reunite by every means at our disposal. This little city on the border seems to me the symbol of a great mission." Adolf Hitler was the third son of the third marriage of a minor Austrian customs official who had been born an illegitimate child and who, for the first 39 years of his life, bore his mother's name, Stickelgruber. The name Hitler appears in the material as well as the paternal line. Both Hitler's grandmother on his mother's side and his grandfather on his father's side were named Hitler, or rather variants of it, for the family name was variously written as Heidler, Hütler, Huetler, and Hitler. Adolf's mother was his father's second cousin, and an episcopal dispensation that to be obtained for the marriage. The forebears of the future German Führer on both sides dwelt for generations in the Waldviertel, a district in Lower Austria between the Danube and the borders of Bohemia and Moravia. In my own Vienna days, I sometimes passed through it on my way to Prague or to Germany. It is a hilly, wooded country of peasant villages and small farms, and though only some 50 miles from Vienna, it has a somewhat remote and impoverished air, as if the main currents of the Austrian life had passed it by. The inhabitants tend to be dour, like the Czech peasants, just to the north of them. Intermarriage is common, as in the case of Hitler's parents, and illegitimacy is frequent. On the mother's side, there was a certain stability. For 4 generations, Clara Powelzel's family remained on peasant holding number 37 in the village of Spittal. The story of Hitler's paternal ancestors is quite different. The spelling of the family name, as we have seen, changes, the place of residence also. There is a spirit of restlessness among the Hitlers, an urge to move from one village to the next, from one job to another, to avoid firm human ties, and to follow a certain bohemian life in relations with women. Johann George Heidler, Adolf's grandfather, was a wandering miller, plying his trade in one village after another in Lower Austria. 5 months after his first marriage, in 1824, A son was born, but the child and the mother did not survive. 18 years later, while working in the Dorenthal, he married a 47-year-old peasant woman from the village of Strones, Maria Anna Stickelgruber. 5 years before the marriage, on June 7th, 1837, Maria had an illegitimate son whom she named Aloy, and who became Adolf Hitler's father. It is most probable that the father of Aloy was Jonathan Heidler, though conclusive evidence is lacking. At any rate, Johann eventually married the woman, but contrary to the usual custom in such cases, he did not trouble himself with legitimizing the son after the marriage. The child grew up as Aloy Stickelgruber. Anna died in 1847, whereupon Johann Heidler vanished for 30 years, only to reappear at the age of 84 in the town of Weitra in the Waldviertel. The spelling of this name now changed to Hitler, to testify before a notary in the presence of 3 witnesses that he was the father of Aloy Stickelgruber. Why the old man waited so long to take this step, or why he finally took it, is not known from the available records. According to Haydn, Aloy later confided to a friend that it was done to help him obtain a share of the inheritance from an uncle, a brother of the miller, who had raised the young in his own household. At any rate, this tardy recognition was made on June 6, 1876, and on November 23rd, the parish priest at Dollersheim, to whose office the notarized statement had been forwarded, scratched out the name Alois Stickelgruber in the baptismal registry and wrote in its place that of Alois Hitler. From that time on, Adolf's father was legally known as Alois Hitler, and the name passed on naturally to his son. It was only during the 1930s that enterprising journalists in Vienna, delving into the parish archives, discovered the facts about Hitler's ancestry, and disregarding old Johann Georg Heidler's belated attempt to do it right by a bastard son, tried to fasten on the Nazi leader the name of Adolf Stickelgruber. There are many weird twists of fate in the strange life of Adolf Hitler, but none more odd than this one, which took place 13 years before his birth. Had the 84-year-old wandering miller not made his unexpected reappearance to recognize the paternity of his 39-year-old son nearly 30 years after the death of mother, Adolf Hitler would have been born Adolf Stickelgruber. There may not be much or anything in a name, but I have heard Germans speculate whether Hitler could have become the master of Germany had he been known to the world as Schicklgruber. My God. Schicklgruber. It was a slightly comic sound as it rolls off the tongue of a South German. Yeah, try an English person. Can one imagine the frenzied German masses acclaiming a Schicklgruber with their thunderous Heils? Heil Schicklgruber! Not only was Heil Hitler used as a Wagnerian pagan-like chant by the multitude in the mystic pageantry of the massive Nazi rallies, but it became the obligatory form of greeting between Germans during the Third Reich, even on the telephone, where it replaced the conventional hello. Heil Schicklgruber. It is a little difficult to imagine. Since the parents of Aloy apparently never lived together, even after they were married, the future father of Adolf Hitler grew up with his uncle, who, though a brother of Johann Georg Hitler, spelled his name differently, being known as Johann von Nepomuk Hitler. In view of the undying hatred which the Nazi Führer would develop from youth on for the Czechs, whose nation he ultimately destroyed, the Christian name is worthy of passing mention. Johann von Nepomuk was the national saint of the Czech people, and some historians have seen in Hitler's being given this name an indication of Czech blood in the family. Aloy Schicklgruber first learned the trade of shoemaker in the village of Spital. There is a footnote on the name Schicklgruber. Hitler himself seems to have recognized this. In his youth, he confided to the only boyhood friend he had that nothing had ever pleased him as much as his father's change of names. He told August Kubizek that the name Schicklgruber seemed to him so uncouth, so boorish, apart from being so clumsy and unpractical. He found Heidler too soft, but Hitler sounded nice and was easy to remember. August Kubizek, The Young Hitler I Know, page 40. End of footnote. Alice Schicklgruber first learned the trade of shoemaker in the village of Spital, but being restless, like his father, he soon set out to make his fortune in Vienna. At 18, he joined the border police in the Austrian customs service near Salzburg, and on being promoted to the customs service itself 9 years later, he married Anna Glassenhauer, the adopted daughter of a customs official. She brought him a small dowry and increased social status, as such things went in the old Austro-Hungarian petty bureaucracy. But the marriage was not a happy one. She was 14 years older than he, of failing health, and she remained childless. After 16 years, they were separated, and 3 years later, in 1883, she died. Before the separation, Aloy, now legally known as Hitler, had taken up with a young hotel cook, Franziska Matzelberger, who bore him a son named Aloy in 1882. 1 month after the death of his wife, he married the cook, and 3 months later she gave birth to a daughter, Angela. The second marriage did not last long. Within a year, Franziska was dead of tuberculosis. 6 months later, Alois Hitler married for the third and last time. The new bride? Clara Polzel, who would shortly become the mother of Adolf Hitler, was 25, her husband 48, and they had long known each other. Clara came from Spital, the ancestral village of the Hitlers. Her grandfather had been Johann von Nepomuk Hitler, with whom his nephew, Alois Schicklgruber Hitler, had grown up. Thus Alois and Clara were second cousins, and they found it necessary, as we have seen, to apply for episcopal dispensation to permit the marriage. It was a union which the customs official had first contemplated years before, when he had taken Clara into his childless home as a foster daughter during his first marriage. The child had lived for years with the Schicklgrubers in Brunau, and as the first wife ailed, Alois seemed to have given thought to marrying Clara as soon as his wife died. His legitimation and his coming into an inheritance from the uncle, who was Clara's grandfather, occurred when the young girl was 16, just old enough to legally marry. But as we have seen, the wife lingered on after the separation, and perhaps because Alois, in the meantime, took up with the cook, Franziska Matzelberger. Clara, at the age of 20, left the household and went to Vienna, where she obtained employment as a household servant. She returned 4 years later to keep house for her cousin. Franziska, too, in the last months of her life, had moved out of her husband's home. Alois Hitler and Clara Poetzel were married on January 7, 1885, and some 4 months and 10 days later their first child, Gustav, was born. He died in infancy, as did the second child, Ida, born in 1886. Adolf was the third child of this third marriage. A younger brother, Edmund, born in 1894, lived only 6 years. The fifth and last child, Paula, born in 1896, lived to survive her famous brother. Adolf's half-brother, Alois, and his half-sister, Angela, the children of Franziska Matzelberger, also lived to grow up. Angela, a handsome young woman, married a revenue official named Rubel, and after his death worked in Vienna as a housekeeper, and for a time, if Hayden's information is correct, as a cook in a Jewish charity kitchen. In 1928, Hitler brought her to Berchtesgaden as his housekeeper, and thereafter one heard a great deal in Nazi circles of the wondrous Viennese pastries and desserts she baked for him, and for which he had such a ravenous appetite. She left him in 1936 to marry a professor of architecture in Dresden, and Hitler, by then Chancellor and dictator, was resentful of her departure and declined to send a wedding present. She was the only person in the family with whom, in his later years, he seems to have been close, with one exception. Angela had a daughter, Gellie Raubel, an attractive young blonde woman with whom, as we shall see, Hitler had the only truly deep love affair of his life. Adolf Hitler never liked to hear mention of his half-brother, Alois Matzelberger, later legitimized as Alois Hitler. Became a waiter, and for many years his life was full of difficulties with the law. Haydn records that at 18 the young man was sentenced to 5 months in jail for theft, and at 20 served another sentence of 8 months on the same charge. He eventually moved to Germany, only to become embroiled in further troubles. In 1924, while Adolf Hitler was languishing in prison for having staged a political revolt in Munich, Alois Hitler was sentenced to 6 months in prison by the Hamburg court for bigamy. Thereafter, Haydn recounts, he moved on to England, where he quickly established a family, and then deserted it. The coming to power of the National Socialists brought better times to Alois Hitler. He opened a Bierstube, a small beer house, in a suburb of Berlin, moving it shortly before the war to the Witzenbergerplatz in the capital's fashionable West End. It was much frequented by Nazi officials, and during the early part of the war, when food was scarce, it inevitably had a plentiful supply. I used to drop in occasionally at that time. Alois was then nearing 60, a portly, simple, good-natured man, with little physical resemblance to his famous half-brother, and in fact indistinguishable from dozens of other little pub-keepers one had seen in Germany and Austria. Business was good, and whatever his past, he was now obviously enjoying the prosperous life. He had only one fear, that his half-brother, in a moment of disgust or rage, might revoke his license. Sometimes there was talk in the little beer-house that the Chancellor and Führer of the Reich regretted this reminder of the humble nature of the Hitler family. Alois himself, I remember, refused to be drawn into any talk whatsoever about his half-brother, a wise precaution, but frustrating to those of us who were trying to learn all we could about the background of the man who by that time had already set out to conquer Europe. Except in Mein Kampf, where the sparse biographical material is often misleading and the omissions monumental, Hitler rarely discussed or permitted discussing of, in his presence, the family background and early life. We have seen what the family background was. What was the early life?